She slid the ring across the white tablecloth with 2 polished fingers and didn't even look at him when she did it. The diamond turned once under the chandelier light, then settled beside his untouched water glass while the whole private dining room went silent, in that particular way expensive places go silent, where nobody wants to be seen staring, but everyone is listening. Naomi Grant leaned back in her chair, folded one leg over the other, and reached for the hand of the man sitting beside her. Not her husband. The man she had already chosen. The man her family had spent months quietly placing around her like an upgrade they assumed she deserved. She believed she was ending Elijah Cole in the most public way possible. She believed she was taking back her life in front of witnesses. She believed she was finally stepping away from a quiet man who had, in her mind, never become the kind of husband worth standing beside. What she did not know, what her mother did not know, what her brother did not know, and what the smiling man at her left had definitely not known, was that 72 hours earlier, Elijah had walked out of a glass tower in downtown Houston after signing a confidential minerals development agreement that would later be valued at $12.8 billion. $12.8 billion. Not projected in fantasy, not discussed over drinks, not bragged about on social media. Signed, filed, locked, and attached very carefully to a revenue structure in which Elijah Cole's name sat exactly where nobody in that room had ever imagined it could. If you've ever watched somebody confuse silence with weakness, stay with me. If you've ever seen a person misjudge someone because he didn't advertise his worth, because he didn't perform his struggle loudly enough, because he wasn't flashy enough for people addicted to appearances, then this story is going to hit harder than you think. And before we go any further, if you're new here, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We tell stories about power, patience, betrayal, and the kind of truth that only shows up after people have already exposed themselves. And tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your city in the comments. Atlanta, Dallas, Chicago, Baltimore, Houston, Detroit. Wherever you are, I like knowing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Elijah Cole. Elijah had grown up in a neighborhood outside Baton Rouge where people measured a man less by how loudly he talked and more by whether his word changed when circumstances did. His father had spent 23 years driving freight routes across Louisiana and Texas, leaving before sunrise and coming home with the kind of tired that belonged to honest work. His mother had worked payroll for a hospital system, the sort of job nobody bragged about and everybody depended on. There was never abundance in the house, but there was order. Bills got paid, promises got kept. Things were fixed instead of replaced, and if something important needed doing, it was done before it was discussed. Elijah learned early that some of the strongest people in the world looked ordinary from the outside. He was not the kind of child teachers described as gifted in a way that made adults excited. He was worse than that, socially speaking. He was steady. He was observant. He turned in work that was better than expected and then went quiet again. He did not know how to sell himself to people who valued performance over substance, and because of that, a lot of people made the mistake of thinking he had less to offer than he actually did. He earned a scholarship to study geophysics, then another one that let him continue into mineral systems modeling. He did field work, long field work, the kind that cooked your skin, ruined your sleep, wore your knees down, and left you returning to cities that no longer felt synchronized to your life. He became very good at reading what was buried under land other people drove past without a second thought. To most people, it was dirt, salt, heat, rock. To Elijah, it was language. Pressure signatures were language. Fracture geometry was language. The wrong kind of silence in a data set was language too. He built a career on reading what nobody else had taken the time to understand. Not glamorous. Not visible. Not the sort of career that impressed women like Naomi Grant's mother. Naomi entered his life when he was 32 at a charity rooftop event in Charlotte. One of those polished social evenings where every table had candles, every conversation contained self-advertisement, and everyone dressed like they were attending their future. Elijah had been invited by an old college friend who now worked in infrastructure finance. Naomi had crossed the terrace toward him with a smile so practiced it looked effortless. She was stunning in a way that drew immediate attention and held it. She had perfect posture, precise speech, and the kind of social fluency that made every interaction seem curated. She laughed at the right moments. She asked questions that suggested interest. She made people feel selected. Elijah, who had never been especially skilled at protecting himself from polished attention, found her magnetic. There are women who are beautiful in a way that makes men feel lucky. And then there are women who are beautiful in a way that makes rooms reorganize around them. Naomi was the second kind. But there was something else there too. Something Elijah noticed and then, because he wanted her badly enough, set aside. She evaluated people while speaking to them. Not cruelly, not openly, but with the cool precision of someone mentally estimating utility. How useful is this person? How impressive? How connected? How elevating? How expensive would it be to stand beside them? And what would the return look like? Elijah noticed it, then ignored it. People ignore important truths every day when attraction offers them a prettier explanation. Naomi's family saw him before they ever knew him. And once they saw him, they filed him. Her mother, Lorraine Grant, belonged to the class of women who had spent so much time managing social reality that they no longer distinguished between what was true and what was merely successful to say out loud. Lorraine was elegant, articulate, immaculately controlled, and permanently dissatisfied by anything that did not reinforce the image she wanted the world to hold of her family. She spoke warmly to people she did not respect. She praised people in ways that reduced them. She smiled with her mouth and never with her eyes. Naomi's older brother, Devin, worked in commercial development and collected networks the way other men collected watches. He believed association itself was achievement. Be seen with the right people. Talk about the right deals. Mention the right clubs. Sit at the right tables. And eventually people will assume you belong wherever money circulates. Their father had passed years earlier, and Lorraine had turned the family into a kind of private institution organized around one principle: never be seen declining. Elijah, in Lorraine's estimation, had two serious flaws. He was professionally respectable, but not socially visible. And he had no instinct whatsoever for status theater. He wore good suits until they wore out. He drove cars for function. He did not name drop. He did not narrate his own competence. He did not understand that in certain circles, people trust packaging before proof. When Naomi married him anyway, Elijah thought it meant love had defeated calculation. It had not. What it meant, though he did not understand this at the time, was that Naomi believed he could be renovated. He had enough intelligence to build on, enough discipline to polish, enough promise to justify investment. She married him, the way ambitious people buy a property in a neighborhood they think will appreciate if they manage it properly. The first year was good enough to be misleading. The second year introduced correction. By the third, Naomi had developed a conversational style with Elijah that was less partnership than strategic disappointment. She never attacked him directly at first. People like Naomi almost never start there. They begin with comparison. Look at where Daniel and Tasha vacationed this year. Did you see the condo Devin's friend bought? Adrian closed another project in Miami. My friend Celeste said her husband never misses an event. Sometimes the comparisons were framed as jokes, sometimes as concerns, sometimes as practical suggestions for the kind of life they should already be building. What Naomi wanted, though she phrased it in softer ways, was visibility. She wanted a husband who arrived, a husband whose success was legible to other people from across a room, a husband whose value could be worn, posted, introduced, and envied. Elijah's work did not behave that way. He disappeared for site reviews. He spent evenings in technical documents. He made money, but not performatively. He was building expertise, not spectacle. To Naomi, this felt like deficiency. To Lorraine, it was worse than deficiency. It was embarrassment with manners. At family dinners, Lorraine would ask Elijah about work with the exact level of interest one gives a local traffic report. And then, without appearing rude, she would shift the room toward the people she truly respected. Developers, fund managers, private equity men. The kind of men who could make a dinner table sound like a stock exchange. One of those men was Adrian Vale. Adrian entered the Grants world through Devin's business circle and looked, to Lorraine, like the answer to a question Naomi had married incorrectly. He was African American, handsome in a sharp, manufactured way, wealthy in the kind of visible manner that comforted people who did not know how to assess anything deeper. Adrian wore tailored suits like he had been assembled inside them. He had a smile calibrated for advantage. He talked about acquisitions over appetizers and casually referenced islands, investors, and moving capital with the fluency of a man who knew that language itself could intimidate. He had money, or at least he had enough of the appearance of money to satisfy people who never looked at the structure under the surface. Naomi did not begin with an affair. She began with admiration, which is how affairs often arrive when people want to keep a clean story about themselves. It was admiration for Adrian's confidence, admiration for his presence, admiration for the way he entered rooms and changed the air in them, admiration for the fact that he looked like the kind of man her mother would never have to explain. Elijah noticed Adrian before he noticed Naomi noticing Adrian. That was the problem with being a man who believes in facts. You assume things need evidence before they become real. But by the time evidence arrives, reality has usually been underway for longer than you want to admit. What changed first was not Naomi's behavior toward Adrian. It was her behavior toward Elijah. Contempt arrived before confession. Impatience thickened. Correction became constant. If Elijah was quiet, she called it withdrawal. If he was tired, she called it absence. If he missed an event because he was on site, she called it neglect. Nothing he did registered neutrally anymore. Everything passed through a filter that translated his character into disappointment. One Thursday night, after returning from a 12-day survey trip in western Nevada, Elijah found an expensive men's jacket hanging over the back of a dining chair in his home. He stood in the doorway, looking at it for a long moment. Navy wool, custom lining, monogram at the cuff. Not his. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He did not rush upstairs. He did not make a scene. He did not call out Naomi's name with the shaky outrage of a man hoping the truth will rearrange itself if announced loudly enough. He simply turned, walked back outside, got into his truck, and drove 2 miles to an all-night diner beside a gas station. That was where he learned, for the first time, that humiliation can arrive cold. Not as rage, not as fire, not as cinematic heartbreak. Sometimes it arrives as a hard, clear stillness in which several years suddenly realign into an explanation you should have recognized earlier. He sat in a booth under harsh fluorescent light with a mug of coffee he did not drink, and understood, in pieces, that the marriage had not merely gone wrong. It had been misread by him from the start. Naomi was not leaving because Adrian existed. Adrian existed because Naomi had already left in her mind and needed a replacement that made her choice look aspirational instead of ugly. He checked into a hotel 20 minutes away and did not go back until morning. Naomi called him 12 times that night. He answered none of them. When they finally spoke, she tried a version of the truth first. "It isn't what you think." Then a more careful version. "We've been struggling for a long time." Then the real one, though still diluted. "I don't think I'm happy with the life we built." The life we built. As if 2 people had arrived equally at its shape. As if she had not spent years rejecting the very foundations that made it possible. Elijah moved into the guest room for 6 weeks. Then he quietly hired an attorney. Her name was Monica Hales, and she had the sort of legal mind that made emotionally manipulative people feel naked within 10 minutes. Monica reviewed the marriage finances, the property structure, Naomi's spending patterns, the ownership documents on the house, and the prenuptial agreement Elijah had insisted on years earlier after his late father advised him never to enter a contract, romantic or financial, that depended entirely on the other party remaining decent. At the time, Naomi had signed the prenup as if doing Elijah a favor. Lorraine had called it insulting. Devin had called it unnecessary. Naomi had called it unromantic. Monica called it excellent. The house, she explained at their second meeting, was solely his. Purchased with his funds, financed in his name, maintained through his accounts. Naomi had lived in it, decorated it, hosted in it. But legally, emotionally inconvenient as that might later become, it was his. "Does she understand that?" Monica asked. Elijah considered the question. "She knows my name is on the deed," he said. "I don't think she's ever thought carefully about what that means." Monica gave him the sort of look lawyers give when they see a future argument coming from a mile away. "Most people don't," she said, "until reality sends them paperwork." What Monica did not yet know was that there was another structure already moving beneath the divorce. A larger one. Something Naomi would have paid attention to if she had understood Elijah well enough to know where his real life actually happened. 9 months earlier, Elijah had accepted an advisory contract tied to a cluster of old mineral rights in northern Arizona. On paper, it was routine. Legacy land, sparse documentation, little public excitement. The kind of assignment big personalities pass over because it does not sound like money. But under the old survey maps, under the revised seismic work, under the brine chemistry, under the inconsistencies that kept bothering Elijah long after more impatient analysts had moved on, there was a pattern. A deep one. A formation linked to lithium-rich brine deposits and adjacent rare earth channels significant enough to reshape the economics of the entire tract. He checked his own assumptions, then checked them again. Then brought in independent modeling, quietly, through contacts who valued evidence more than noise. They confirmed what he had suspected. The numbers were real. The scale was real. And the landowner, an aging black rancher named Curtis Randall, whose family had held the property for generations, while wealthier people kept trying to buy pieces of it cheap, finally had leverage strong enough to command terms instead of accepting them. That part mattered to Elijah. He liked Curtis immediately. Curtis ironed his own shirts, spoke without hurry, and distrusted excitement on principle. When Elijah first explained the significance of the surveys, Curtis had sat for a full minute looking out across his land before saying, "So what you're telling me is, they weren't smarter than me. They were just early and louder." "That's close enough," Elijah said. A consortium formed around the tract: battery infrastructure, domestic supply security, processing rights, transportation corridors, environmental oversight. The public headlines would come much later, simplified for people who understood only the top number. But inside the structure was the thing that changed Elijah's life: a negotiated founder advisory stake and revenue participation clause tied specifically to the discovery pathway, the technical interpretation, and the acquisition architecture his analysis had made possible. He did not brag about it. He did not tell Naomi. Not because he was planning revenge, because at first it did not feel real enough to survive casual conversation. Some things are too large to expose to people who handle reality carelessly. He signed the final agreement 3 days before Naomi arranged the dinner. 3 days. By then, the divorce was already underway. By then, the marriage was already broken beyond repair. By then, Elijah had begun to understand that some people can stand beside value for years and still never recognize it if it isn't packaged in the language they prefer. The dinner invitation came by text. "We need to handle this like adults. Maison Verdier, Friday, 8 p.m. Maison Verdier was exactly the sort of place Lorraine Grant would choose if she wanted a setting to do emotional violence under good lighting. Muted gold walls, waiters trained to disappear, menus without prices on the side, handed to women when old money wanted to flatter itself. Elijah arrived at 7:58 and immediately understood the evening had not been organized as a conversation. It had been staged as judgment. Naomi was already there. So was Lorraine. So was Devon. So was Adrian. 4 people on one side of the long table, 1 chair on the other. His chair. The arrangement told the story before anyone spoke. Naomi was wearing white, not bridal white, post-marriage white. The kind selected by women who want innocence to read from a distance. Adrian sat beside her with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he had won something measurable. Lorraine looked almost serene. Devon could not hold Elijah's gaze for more than a second. That detail would matter later. Elijah sat down. A server poured water. Nobody touched it. Naomi began. She had rehearsed. That much was obvious within the first 30 seconds. The sadness in her voice had timing. Her pauses had shape. She spoke of loneliness, of emotional distance, of years spent waiting for a husband who was physically present only in fragments and emotionally present, according to her version, hardly at all. She spoke of growing apart, of incompatibility, of finally recognizing that she had stayed inside a marriage out of loyalty long after love had stopped being enough. Lorraine entered at measured intervals to support the narrative. A mother's concern, a family's disappointment, the pain of watching Naomi diminish herself for a relationship that had never fully honored her. Adrian, to his credit, mostly said nothing. Men like Adrian often understand when visibility itself is their main role in the scene. They don't need words. Their presence is supposed to do the humiliating. Elijah let them speak. That was what unsettled Naomi first. She had expected defensiveness, maybe anger, maybe pleading. Maybe some last desperate attempt by a quiet man to reclaim dignity inside a room designed to strip it from him. What she got instead was attention. Not agreement, not surrender. Just a level, steady attention that made everyone else feel, though they couldn't yet name why, slightly less certain of themselves. At one point, Naomi said, "I finally realized I deserve a life that reflects who I am." Lorraine added, before Naomi could continue, "She deserves a man with reach, with visibility, with actual options." That line stayed in the air. Devon looked down at his drink. The couple at the adjacent table stopped speaking altogether. Elijah looked at Lorraine, then at Naomi, then at Adrian, and finally said the only question he asked all evening. "When did all of you decide I was too small to deserve basic respect?" Nobody answered immediately, because the question had done what precise questions often do. It had stripped the performance and left the mechanics exposed. Naomi recovered first. "This isn't about disrespect. It's about honesty." "No," Elijah said quietly. Honesty would have happened in private. That landed harder than Naomi expected. "You always do this," she said. "You make everything sound calmer than it is so you can act like you're above it." Elijah almost smiled. "No, Naomi," he said. "I just learned a long time ago that some people need chaos in the room to feel like they're winning." Then came the ring. She slipped off the engagement ring, not the wedding band, the engagement ring, and placed it on the table like returning merchandise. "I don't want this anymore," she said. "If I'm being completely honest, it was never really the ring I would have chosen." Lorraine made a small, approving sound. Adrian shifted in his seat, not quite comfortably. Elijah looked at the ring. He remembered the year he bought it, the overtime, the skipped weekends, the conversation with the jeweler who had shown him stones beyond his budget, and then, after seeing the way Elijah kept reaching back toward one particular ring, found him a payment schedule. He remembered carrying the box to his truck with hands that had actually shaken. He remembered believing sincerity itself would protect what he was building. He picked the ring up, closed his hand around it, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he folded his napkin and set it beside his plate. "All right," he said. That was all. No explosion, no sermon, no demand, no public collapse for the audience Naomi had assembled. He stood. "Monica will be in contact with your attorney on Monday," he said. "There are some property matters we need to resolve immediately. And Naomi, use the next few days carefully." For the first time that evening, uncertainty crossed her face. "What is that supposed to mean?" "You'll understand when your lawyer explains it." Then he buttoned his jacket, nodded once to the table, and walked out. On the sidewalk outside Maison Verdier, the night air felt almost cold. He stood beneath the canopy lights for a few seconds and breathed. Then he called the one person who had known him long enough to hear truth without trying to decorate it. His cousin Malcolm answered on the second ring. "She did it publicly," Elijah said. Malcolm was quiet. "Family there?" "All of them. Even him." Another silence. "You okay?" Elijah looked through the restaurant window at the blurred movement inside and said something that would later prove more accurate than dramatic. "I think I'm done being surprised." He drove home. His home. That mattered now. Inside the kitchen, he opened his laptop and read the signed Randall Basin agreement one more time. Not because he doubted it, because sometimes you need to see the new reality in black and white, after old reality has finished disgracing itself in front of you. The filings were intact. The revenue clause was intact. The equity waterfall was intact. His name was exactly where it needed to be. He slept better that night than he had in almost a year. Monday morning, Monica listened to the full dinner account without interrupting. When Elijah finished, she asked, "Tell me again about the agreement you mentioned last week. From the beginning." So he did. He explained the basin, the advisory structure, the confidentiality, the projected valuation, the timeline, the separation of the deal from marital property under the existing prenup, and the pre-filing discovery dates. Monica did not react dramatically. That was one of the reasons he trusted her. When she finally spoke, it was in the tone of a woman mentally reorganizing an entire case file. "This changes the picture," she said. "Significantly. I figured it might." "No, Elijah," she said. "Significantly." She brought in a specialist on complex asset shielding and high net worth dissolution, not because Elijah had become the kind of person he once imagined existed somewhere far from him, but because paperwork had. That is how lives change. Usually not with music, with documents, with signatures, with dates, with who knew what and when. The first formal disclosure Naomi's attorney received did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived bound, tabbed, indexed, and devastating. 43 pages. Ownership schedules. Property proofs. Separate asset structure. Revenue participation model. Advisory stake protections. Timeline authentication. Prenuptial references. Projected value ranges. Naomi read it once and thought there had been a mistake. Then twice. Then called Lorraine in the middle of a Tuesday morning, speaking too fast to preserve dignity. "Mama," she said, "he has real money." Lorraine, who had spent years saying exactly the opposite in more polite words, went completely silent. "How much?" she asked at last. Naomi gave her the conservative range, not the highest figure, not the number the press would eventually amplify, the low protected estimate from the legal packet. Lorraine sat down before Naomi had finished talking. That was what Devon later told someone, which eventually made its way back to Malcolm, which eventually made its way to Elijah. "Your mother sat down," Devon had said. "I've never seen her do that over a phone call in my life." 3 days later, Naomi's attorney requested reconsideration on several fronts. Monica rejected each one with the patience of a woman who knew the law was about to become educational. The house was his. The basin agreement was separate property. The revenue stake had been structured correctly. The filing dates were clean. The arguments available to Naomi's side were not arguments likely to succeed. They tried anyway. People often do when the truth has arrived too late for them to preserve pride. Adrian called Naomi twice the week after the disclosure. The first call lasted 19 minutes. The second lasted 4. What he wanted, though he never said it explicitly, was reassurance that the money now orbiting Elijah could somehow still become relevant to him through proximity, leverage, negotiation, or emotional confusion. But 2 things were already becoming clear. First, Naomi no longer controlled the emotional terrain as completely as she had assumed. Second, Adrian was not built for adversity that did not flatter him. Men who enter somebody else's marriage like a promotion rarely stay when the accounting turns complicated. The public filing hit 10 days later. Financial outlets reported the broader acquisition and domestic minerals supply corridor. Trade publications ran the headline numbers. Most casual readers saw only a large deal in a sector they barely followed. But the names inside the regulatory structure mattered to the people who knew how to look. And the people in Lorraine Grant's world absolutely knew how to look once a number attached itself to gossip. Everything began to shift in the quiet, socially deniable way status shifts among people who pride themselves on subtlety. Conversation stopped half a second too late when Lorraine entered rooms. An invitation she expected never came. A committee seat went to someone else. A brunch turned awkward. Two women who had once listened eagerly to Lorraine's assessments of other people now responded with the careful neutrality of women who were protecting themselves from association with a misjudgment that had become expensive. That was the particular cruelty of the correction. Nobody needed to accuse Lorraine openly. All that mattered was that her central claim had been publicly disproven. For years, she had treated Elijah as a decent but minor man Naomi had outgrown. Now, the very circles she'd used as a standard of worth would have preferred, had they understood in time, to claim him. Lorraine could not apologize, because apology would require admitting that her own measuring system had failed. And some people would rather lose social oxygen than confess they were wrong at the foundation. Naomi, meanwhile, discovered something even uglier than regret. She discovered reclassification. The people who had once framed her as refined and selective now began quietly recoding her as reckless. Not because she had cheated. Those worlds forgive cheating all the time when it produces an upgrade. No, what they could not forgive was cheating downward by accident. Rejecting a quiet husband is one thing. Rejecting a quiet husband who turns out to control the most serious money in the room is social malpractice. That is how those people think. Not morally, strategically. Adrian's withdrawal was not dramatic. He simply became difficult to schedule. Then difficult to reach. Then conceptually unavailable. The warm certainty with which he had sat beside Naomi at Maison Verdier dissolved the minute the story no longer positioned him as the obvious winner. He had not wanted Naomi herself. Not really. He had wanted the easy prestige of taking her from a man he assumed lacked force. Once Elijah's reality became visible, Adrian saw something people like him always see when advantage changes direction. Risk. Naomi called him one Sunday evening and heard a version of truth in his voice for the first time. "I think you need space to deal with everything going on." Everything going on. As if she had not detonated most of it herself. As if he had not entered the blast zone smiling. She laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because humiliation sometimes strips illusion fast enough to create a sound almost identical to laughter. "Space?" she said. "That's what you're calling this?" Adrian gave her the polished silence of a man choosing self-preservation over loyalty. After that, they were effectively over. The house notice was served the following week. 60 days. Plenty of time legally. An eternity emotionally. Naomi cried when she saw the papers. Not because she had nowhere to go. Lorraine would have taken her in, though only after converting it into a story about family devotion under strain. No. Naomi cried because for the first time in years, something in her life was being defined by consequence rather than image. She called Elijah that night. He almost didn't answer. Almost. When he did, she spoke too quickly. "You're really going to do this?" He stood in his kitchen looking at the framed electrical bill on the counter he'd forgotten to file, and answered with the kind of calm that had once irritated her and now seemed to frighten her. "I'm not doing anything to you, Naomi. I'm following the legal process." "This is vindictive." "No," he said. "Public dinner scenes are vindictive. Ownership enforcement is administration." She was quiet for several seconds. Then she asked the question that mattered more than any of the others. "When were you going to tell me?" "About the basin?" he said. Yes. Elijah considered the truth and gave it to her without ornament. I don't know, Naomi. I'm not sure I ever felt safe telling you good news before someone else got to weigh it. That landed where it needed to, because it was true. Naomi had spent years treating his life as provisional unless validated by people she admired more than him. What exactly do you think of me? She asked at last, and her voice no longer sounded angry, only tired. I think, Elijah said, that you decided who I was before you ever really looked at me. And after that, everything I did had to fit the version of me that made you comfortable. She didn't answer. He ended the call gently. There was nothing left in it that could save them. A week later, Lorraine did something she had never done before. She called Elijah directly. No intermediaries, no Naomi, no strategic dinner. She called him herself, which told him immediately that the architecture she usually operated through had failed her. She began, as expected, with moral indictment disguised as dignity. She spoke of grace, of years of family inclusion, of Naomi's sacrifices, of how cruel it was to remove a woman from the home she had built. Elijah let her finish. Then he said, Lorraine, there is a difference between decorating a place and owning it. I think you understand that better than most people. She inhaled sharply. You are punishing her. No, he said. I'm declining to protect her from the consequences of humiliating me while misunderstanding who I was. That wasn't who we thought you were, Lorraine said. And there it was. Not apology, not remorse, just astonishment that reality had refused to match her assessment. I know, Elijah said. That's the problem. He ended the call before she could recover. There are moments in certain lives when power arrives not as control over others, but as the permanent loss of any need to explain yourself to the people who misread you. That was one of those moments. The months that followed were busy in the least glamorous way. Meetings, transit, counsel, site visits, financial planning, risk review, tax structures. Curtis Randall, the landowner, once told Elijah over barbecue at a folding table near the basin offices, "Everybody thinks wealth changes your life because of what you can suddenly buy. I think it changes your life because of what nonsense you can finally stop tolerating." Elijah laughed harder at that than Curtis expected, because that was exactly right. He retained an advisor, paid off his mother's mortgage without making an event of it, established a scholarship in his father's name for black students entering geology, mineral engineering, and environmental systems from working-class families. He funded it quietly. No dinner, no gala, no plaque larger than necessary. When the university called to ask if he wanted to attend the public announcement, he declined and requested that the recipients be centered instead. That was Elijah all over. Even money had not altered his instinct for gravity. Naomi moved into a high-rise rental that looked better in photographs than it felt at night. She took a consulting role she was, underneath all the performance and confusion, perfectly capable of doing. That part surprised some people who had mistaken her for decorative. Elijah did not. One of the tragedies of their marriage had been that Naomi possessed real competence and had buried too much of it beneath comparison. She had spent so long trying to inhabit a life that looked expensive from the outside that she had lost touch with the parts of herself that could have built one honestly. Devon adjusted before Lorraine did. Men like Devon often do. Their morality may be underdeveloped, but their survival instinct is excellent. He called Elijah one afternoon under the thin excuse of just checking in. Elijah let him talk for nearly 6 minutes before saying, "Devin, what exactly do you want from this conversation?" Silence. Then, surprisingly, a little truth. "I want to know if you hate all of us." Elijah looked out his office window at the loading yard below and thought about the question. "No," he said. "Hate takes too much sustained interest." That answer unsettled Devin more than anger would have, because anger preserves importance. Indifference removes it. Still, something in Devin shifted after that. Maybe shame. Maybe perspective. Maybe just the discomfort of seeing his family clearly for the first time. He began, in small, private ways, telling his mother no, correcting Naomi when she edited history, acknowledging what had happened without polishing it into something more flattering. Small honesty is not transformation, but it is often where transformation starts. The final divorce meeting took place in Monica's conference room on a Wednesday afternoon that smelled faintly of rain and printer paper. Everything had already been negotiated. Documents were prepared, signatures flagged. No unresolved financial disputes remained. No ambiguity. No hidden landmines. Just the formal completion of something that had been dead for a long time and buried only recently. Naomi arrived in a charcoal suit, with no jewelry except a watch Elijah had never seen before. She looked composed. Not theatrically composed. Not, "I will make this look elegant" composed. Something quieter. Something less certain. The kind of composure people earn only after public error has burned through vanity and left them with fewer places to hide. Through her attorney, she requested 10 minutes alone with Elijah before signing. Monica advised against it. Elijah allowed it. They sat in a smaller conference room across from each other, a box of tissues on a shelf behind Naomi, positioned there by some administrative realism Monica's office had likely acquired from experience. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Naomi said the one sentence Elijah had not expected. "I didn't know how much of my life was built around being seen correctly by the wrong people." He said nothing. She kept going. "I thought I was choosing upward. I thought I was protecting myself from a future that felt too small. And the worst part is, even after I found out about the money, I knew that wasn't the real point." Elijah watched her carefully. She looked tired, but not from lack of sleep. Tired the way people look when they've spent years holding a pose they can no longer sustain. "The money didn't create what was wrong," she said. "It just exposed how wrong I already was." That was honest. Not enough to repair anything. Nothing could. But honest. "I think I made a category mistake with you," she said finally. "I looked at your quiet and called it lack. I looked at your patience and called it weakness. I looked at your work and called it boring because nobody important to me knew how to clap for it." Elijah leaned back slightly. That is the closest she had ever come to understanding him while they were together. "I think that's true," he said. She nodded once. Then she said, "I'm sorry for what I did at that dinner. Not for leaving. For the way I needed witnesses." He let the apology sit between them. It was not redemptive. The world is full of apologies that come too late and still matter because, late as they are, they stop lying. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate you saying it clearly." Naomi's eyes filled then, but she did not cry. "I don't need anything from you," she said quickly, almost defensively. "I know that." "I know," he said. She looked down at her hands. I think I spent years wanting a life that looked expensive to people who were never going to love me anyway. That one he felt. Because it was not just a confession about her. It was a confession about Lorraine's whole system. And systems like that do not merely damage the people excluded from them. They damage the people raised inside them, too. They signed 10 minutes later. The attorneys exchanged the tired professional courtesy of people who had completed a difficult file properly. Monica walked Elijah to the elevator. "That went well," she said. From Monica, this was nearly exuberant. Elijah drove home in light rain. At a red light, he noticed he was gripping the wheel loosely for the first time in months. No bracing, no anticipation, no rehearsed arguments. Just rain on glass and a life moving forward without explanation attached. He called Malcolm. "It's done," he said. "How do you feel?" Elijah thought for a second. "Useful again," he said. Malcolm laughed. "That's the most you answer like yourself when you're relieved." "Maybe." A year later, Elijah met Dr. Simone Avery at an environmental water systems conference in New Mexico. She was African American, brilliant, mildly sarcastic, and entirely uninterested in social choreography. Their first conversation was about aquifer stress and federal incompetence. Their second lasted 3 hours over coffee that became dinner by accident. Simone asked real questions and waited for real answers. She had none of Naomi's appetite for image management and all of the intelligence Naomi had once wanted reflected back to her from the right crowd. Elijah did not fall quickly because he no longer believed quickness was evidence of depth. But he did notice, after a few months, that time around Simone felt unperformed. That mattered more than beauty, though she had that too. It mattered more than admiration. It mattered more than chemistry. Peace is one of the most underrated forms of attraction in the world. Lorraine, according to people who still circulated near her, continued holding herself together with the discipline of a woman who would rather be misunderstood forever than corrected once in public. But the correction had already happened. And social ecosystems do not forget expensive errors. Naomi built something smaller and truer for herself in the years that followed. Not glamorous, not loudly envied, but hers. The updates that occasionally reached Elijah through old channels suggested she was kinder now. Less impressed by surfaces. More careful with language. More aware that a person can wreck their own life simply by outsourcing their judgment to the shallowest room they have access to. He wished her well. Truly. Not from saintliness. Not from superiority. Only because bitterness is attention, and Elijah had more valuable places to put his. Now here is the truth at the center of this story, and it has less to do with billions than people think. Money changed the outcome, yes. It exposed the hypocrisy. It rearranged the power. It made public what had been privately misjudged. But the deeper truth is older than money. People are constantly making category mistakes about one another. They look at quiet and call it weakness. They look at steadiness and call it lack of ambition. They look at discipline without display and assume nothing important is happening. They look at a person who does not advertise his burdens, and because he does not perform them, they assume he isn't carrying any. That is one of the oldest and most dangerous misreadings in human relationships. Because the people doing the deepest work often look unimpressive to audiences addicted to spectacle. The builder does not always resemble the salesman. The strategist does not always resemble the winner in the first act. The person accumulating real leverage rarely feels the need to narrate it for a room full of shallow judges. And then one day, the paperwork arrives. One day, the truth becomes legible. One day, the exact people who laughed too comfortably, condescended too casually, or replaced you too confidently, discover that they were standing in the presence of value their own measuring tools were too cheap to detect. That doesn't happen every time. Life is not a fairy tale vending machine. Sometimes wrong people stay wrong and never get corrected in public. But sometimes they do. Sometimes the facts organize themselves so cleanly that a whole room has to live inside its own embarrassment. And when that happens, the most powerful thing in the world is often not revenge. It is restraint. It is the ability to let reality speak in its own voice. It is the discipline to say less than the moment seems to deserve. It is the refusal to become ugly just because ugliness has been offered to you in public. Elijah did not win because Naomi humiliated him. He won because what she revealed at that table was not his smallness. It was hers. And once that kind of revelation becomes visible, all you really have to do is stop interrupting it. So let me ask you something. If you had been in Elijah's position, and somebody pushed that ring across the table in front of their family, in front of the replacement they thought was better, in front of strangers close enough to hear your dignity being priced out loud, what would you have done? Would you have answered them right there? Would you have exposed the deal immediately? Would you have laughed? Would you have walked away exactly as he did? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. And if this story stayed with you, hit like before you go. That one click helps this channel more than most people realize. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now. Because the next story I have for you is about another quiet man, another bad public decision, and another room full of people who found out too late that they had misread everything. I'll see you in the next one.